to celebrate 500 years of science and to encourage the next generation in pursuit of science. Now, logic programming's history hasn't been that long, but we have a very good candidate for tell us about all the ups and downs of the logic programming history. So I give you Bob Kowalski. We have the honor for him to give us this perspective tonight.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Everybody asked, why did you accept? If you're so nervous. Okay, I accepted because how can you turn down such an honor? It is an honor, and I thank you. I thank you. Well, 50 years of logic and artificial intelligence. Why 50 years? Because 50 years ago, in October 1967, I started my PhD at the University of Edinburgh in the field of automated deduction. What a different world it was way back then. Things were so different. There was just a tiny community working in artificial intelligence, never mind in logic and artificial intelligence. You could say it was an age of innocence. There was no internet, no big data, no Facebook, no Twitter, no Donald Trump. But my work in this field, in a sense, goes back 60 years, not merely 50 years. Because when I was still in school, I read bits of Jones' Guide to Philosophy. I found it extremely exciting. The philosophy of Plato, of Aristotle, of Hume, of Berkeley, of Kant. No Bertrand Russell, no Frege. It was confusing. It was extremely confusing. Each philosophy seemed to make sense in its own right, but they all contradicted each other. And I felt, surely there must be a truth. So I set out on a course, hopefully, to find the truth. The next year or two, I entered the University of Chicago as an undergraduate, and I was introduced to mathematical logic in my very first year. Fantastic. It seemed to me there could be no greater truth than the truths to be found in mathematics, and specifically in logic itself, which is designed by its very nature to be concerned with problems of truth. So I was extremely excited and extremely optimistic, but unfortunately I didn't stay the course. I left somewhere in the middle of my second year. I worked in a chemical factory for a year and a half, and in the end I went to the University of Bridgeport and commuted from home, and I couldn't study philosophy because there wasn't a philosophy department. So I taught myself, as I did as a high school student, enough logic to get into Stanford in, what year was that? Whatever year that was.
A long time ago.
A long time ago, and I wanted to study logic. And you have a choice. You can either, in those days, actually I had a choice between three options. I could study philosophical logic as a postgraduate, but I didn't have a background in philosophy. I could do mathematical logic because I did the mathematics degree at the University of Bridgeport. I was offered a place to do a PhD in computer science. John McCarthy had just entered Stanford, but that was the last thing I would possibly want to consider, because it was the only course at the University of Bridgeport which I nearly failed. Fortran programming. So I embarked on a PhD in mathematical logic, but I really wanted to study logic. Mathematical logic is not logic. I ended up, a year or so later, starting 50 years ago, in October of this year, it will be 50 years, I started my PhD in Edinburgh. Now, I didn't want to do computer science. I wanted to do logic that was relevant to human affairs. But there is no logic to be studied that's relevant to human affairs, even today to some extent, and certainly not in 1967. So I entered Edinburgh, the computer science department, the meta mathematics unit, And I eventually decided I'm not going to pull out of another PhD or drop out of another university. I'm going to give it all I've got and get out of here as soon as possible and start my life. I was lucky. I was extremely lucky. Edinburgh was where the action was in artificial intelligence. In the world, there were only 4 or 5 centers, and in Europe there was only basically one, and that was Edinburgh at the time. The machine intelligence workshops in particular attracted researchers from all over the world. Stanford was a special had a special relationship with Edinburgh in particular. In the particular year that I entered, Pat Hayes entered in the exact same month as I did, and we worked together and were very good friends. Alan Robinson had been moving from Rice University to Syracuse University, and he was spending a sabbatical the very year that I entered Edinburgh. And there were many other very prominent people. In those days, the community was not only very small, but it was not isolated from the rest of computer science. The machine intelligence series in particular published papers that had not only contact with artificial intelligence, but theory of computing. Theory of computing, John McCarthy contributed to theory of computing, and it was not divorced. It was very closely knit, and you could aspire to have a general view of the field as a whole. It might have been 1/100th the size that it is today. It's impossible to have a global perspective on what's going on in our subject today. Well, there we go. That particular workshop in which Pat Hayes published his paper with John McCarthy on situation calculus was also my first publication on semantic trees. It was written just a few months after I started, thanks mainly to Alan Robinson being there so that I could have direct access to the latest results. Impossible to be in a better environment. In that same workshop, however, there was in many ways a more important paper than either mine or in many ways, perhaps even than Hayes and McCarthy. A paper, again coming from Stanford by Cordell Green, which applied Robinson's resolution principle to a vast number of different applications, focusing to start with on question answering. You could call it databases, so you put information into logical form and you ask questions about that. And Cordell Green showed how to apply resolution very interestingly to that application. He also showed how to use resolution for robot planning and what he called automatic programming. A complicated idea, but very closely related to the idea of writing specifications that execute and automatically solve your problem for you. There was a tremendous, Cordell Green's work attracted tremendous interest in this, I would say throughout the world, but the world was so small, it was throughout our small community. But at the same time, over at MIT, people like Marvin Minsky, Terry Winograd, Carl Hewitt argue that uniform proof procedures are not the way people think, and they're not the way we should program computers. Computers need to be told heuristics that control the reasoning process. Winograd gave an example which has a logical feel to it. Winograd's point was not say it as it is, but rather that information of that seemingly logical form was useless unless you could control it. And he wanted to argue that all humans are mortal. Is that right? Yes. He wanted to argue that it should be thought of as, or should be controlled and turned into a procedure for showing that a person is mortal by showing they're human, or by deriving that a person is mortal. And he argued that the control component was more important than the logical component. This was, as I say, so influential that many of the people who were working in the resolution theorem proving field quietly went away. I did not go away because I hadn't finished my PhD. I didn't have a choice. But I teamed up with Donald Keeter, who had taught me mathematics at the University of Bridgeport, and we developed a refinement of resolution, which eliminated a huge amount of redundancy, but not only eliminated redundancies, but also eliminated irrelevancies by working backwards from goals to sub-goals. So instead of deriving arbitrary consequences, it would focus on the problem to be solved. We call this selected linear resolution, SL resolution. And we published our paper, which was written in '69, eventually in 1971. And during the course of the publication process, we became aware of the procedural representations that were being promoted from MIT, and we remark at the end of the paper that we believed that this approach would be competitive with what we called purely heuristic approaches, meaning those advocated at MIT. Well, out of the mainstream, down in Marseille, Alan Komrauer, who had previously worked in Quebec, is it Montreal, Quebec? Developed a formal grammar system which was used for machine translation, and was actually the first industrial machine translation system used to translate between French and English weather forecasts. So here was a guy working with virtually no contact with the main contributors to the field, who was, a really brilliant and productive person. And as unique as he was, instead of going to Paris or Grenoble or any of those other major places where he could have been perhaps a competitor to the workers in the mainstream, he decided to go to Marseille, where he could be in charge of what was going on. And in charge he was. He very quickly set up a group, a very powerful little group, to work on question answering, using, of course, his work on formal grammars, but also using resolution theorem proving. And when he found out about SL resolution, he invited me to Marseille. That was in the summer of 1971. We spent a few days together, one of the most exciting, intellectually exciting days of my life. We worked deep into the night, and after 4 or 5 days we had together discovered how to represent grammars in logical form in such a way that if you parse them if you run them with SL resolution, you get a top-down parser. If you run them with hyper-resolution, suitably constrained, you get bottom-up parsers. And this was fantastic. We were so excited that we went away. I continued to try to understand planner and these procedural representations of knowledge at MIT and how they could be reconciled with resolution, SL resolution logic. And he in turn worked on question answering using SL resolution as the engine for reasoning to derive answers to questions in logical form. He invited me for a longer period in the summer of 1972, and we worked together once again, but not as intensively. He had to teach a course. I had to write a paper for Machine Intelligence 5 or 6 or whatever it was at that time. But nonetheless, through our interactions over coffee and whatnot, both logic programming and Prolog were born. Who exactly had what idea, what stage, no one will remember so many years later, but it was a wonderful time. I was so excited, I wrote to my supervisor, Bernard Meltzer, who was the guy who also started the Journal of Artificial Intelligence and was one of the co-editors of the Machine Intelligence series. And I told him about this fantastic stuff that we discovered. And he shared this news with other people working in our group. And they included Pat Hayes and Martin Van Emden and David H.D. Warren. And it was just so different from what people had expected, because the spirits had been so low when all of this attack had been coming against our work from MIT. Martin, who was much more of a mathematician than me and who knew more about computer science than me, suggested that we looked at theory of computation and how theories of computation apply to this new programming paradigm that we were working on. And he suggested specifically that we looked at the fixed point theory that was then being developed by Dana Scott and mostly distributed in handwritten mimeographed notes. And out of that study emerged the fixed point theory of logic programs and the minimal model semantics in particular, which was something totally different from, as far as I know, anything that had been considered in theory of computing until that time. I wrote to Dana Scott because he had taught me axiomatic set theory at Stanford, which was the best and most instructive course I had at Stanford. And I thought he might be interested and maybe even impressed, but he was not impressed.
Sounds like academics.
Well, I stayed in Edinburgh until 1975. I was invited to apply to what was called a readership at Imperial College in the theory of computing. Now, the fact that I knew, I still know, you might say, virtually nothing about computing was considered a handicap. And there were those who realized that and delayed my appointment for some considerable period of time. But nonetheless, eventually, in January '75, I came to Edinburgh and it was landed with a course on formal languages and automata, which I knew absolutely nothing about except what RuleMLRR had taught me in Marseille about formal grammars. Fortunately, Keith Clark had written a book recently about the same subject, and he was quite generous in mentoring me while I gave my lectures, and I was able in that way to stay 1 week ahead of my course. Thank you, Keith. So there we are in Edinburgh, Keith and I. In fact, it was mostly Keith and I because everybody else was doing...
Why in Edinburgh, Bob? In Imperial?
Oh, well, I don't know. No.
Sorry.
So we've been around the world a little bit. We've been to Stanford, we've been to MIT, sort of by proxy, Edinburgh, Marseille. But over in Toulouse, Hervé Galaire and Jean-Marie Nicolas are working on deductive databases. They know about logic programming and they are looking at applying logic programming to databases, and in particular to integrity checking in deductive databases, already in 1978. Jack Binker in Maryland was also interested in similar ideas, and they collaborated together to hold the first workshop on logic and databases in Toulouse in 1978. It was another great event, but it received a damning review from one of the world's greatest computer scientists. But that workshop contained a number of important papers, just like the machine intelligence 1968 workshop proceedings, so too the proceedings of the 78, is that 68, 70, 10 years later, workshop contained Keith Clark's famous paper on negation as failure, the first semantics for negation as failure, and Ray Reiter's paper on the closed world assumption, and a number of other papers, including my own wonderful paper on logic and databases, which exceptionally this famous computer scientist spoke positively about. Anyway, that was hard times. But in general, except for that rather awful review, logic programming was gaining more and more worldwide attention, mainly in Europe. Partly due to my Volkswagen van in which I traveled around Europe spreading the good news. Nonetheless, the main centers were in Edinburgh and Imperial College in the late 70s, early 80s. And then, and I should say that at Imperial we did some great stuff. We developed courses for teaching children logic as a computer language, which was very successful for a relatively short time, I'm sorry to say. We, in Fariba in particular, worked on the logical representation of the British Nationality Act, which revolutionized the field of logic and, law and artificial intelligence. To this very day, logic programming remains the dominant approach to formalization of legal language. We developed the event calculus, a competitor to Pat Hayes and McCarthy's situation calculus, and Keith developed Parallel, a concurrent version of logic programming, which was picked up by the Japanese fifth generation project. Now, the fifth generation project changed everything. In 1982, the Japanese government decided that they would skip a generation of computers and move from the current third generation, skipping the fourth and going directly to the fifth. And this new generation of computers was going to have highly parallel computer architectures based on data flow concepts and be oriented towards artificial intelligence applications. The link between the hardware, the computer architectures, and the artificial intelligence applications was going to be logic programming. Not Prolog, but Parlog and concurrent logic programming languages like that. It was a massive investment, and the Japanese government invited collaboration. They invited the British, French, and German governments to collaborate with them, and they refused, as you can probably imagine. However, competing projects were set up throughout the world because of this fear that the Japanese, who had been so successful with other industries like the auto industry and the electronics industry, would do the same as they promised, because they said they would leapfrog IBM, and in particular that was a stated objective. So the European Computer Research Center was set up in Munich under Hervé Galler's direction. It had a logic programming focus, similar to the logic programming focus of the Japanese fifth generation project. The Microcomputer Corporation in Austin was set up by a collaborative group of American computers. Now in the United Kingdom, we also had a competitive project called the ALBI project, and enormous resources were put into competing with the Japanese fifth generation project, but not with logic programming. It was going to compete at the level of hardware, it was going to work on formal methods, it was going to do a little work on databases, it was going to work on intelligent knowledge-based systems. Why did the Japanese decide on logic programming? It was because Koichi Furukawa, who later became deputy director of the fifth generation project, had visited SRI, where they had Komrower's Fortran compiler for Prolog. And it was Furukawa, and I'll mention Furukawa again in a moment later, who convinced the Japanese establishment to go the logic programming route. Well, the fifth generation project was deemed to have failed. The fifth generation project did not leapfrog IBM. It did not move from the third to the fifth generation after 10 years of massive effort. In fact, it didn't really do much work on Prolog, despite some claims that it did. And what happened was that artificial intelligence and logic programming both went into worldwide decline. Logic programming, which at the beginning of the 80s was among some quarters seen as the coming light, was now deemed to be bad news. Expert systems also suffered, and artificial intelligence suffered as a whole. So how to judge the failure of the fifth generation project? Did it truly fail? And if it did it fail simply because it was ahead of its time? Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it was ahead of its time. In recent years, in the last 10 years in particular, we've seen a resurgence of logic programming with companies like Logic Blocks in Atlanta, Georgia, using Datalog, which is a specialized database-oriented sublanguage of logic programming. We've seen Google develop its own logic programming language, Datalog. We've seen books published by psychologists performing experiments to show that human thinking has logic programming form, specifically the book by Keith Stenning and Michael van Lamalken. So there's a resurgence of logic programming, and you could easily conclude that if the fifth generation project failed, it was simply because the time wasn't right. Well, I've thought hard about it. In particular, I had an obligation to think hard about it because the Japanese asked me to chair the final panel of the fifth generation conference project conference, and to assemble experts from around the world to judge the results of the 10-year effort. So with the directors of the project, we chose Tony Hoare, Hervé Galère, and a number of other world experts to pass judgment on the fifth generation project. And we did our best to hide the fact that we thought it actually didn't achieve its objectives. But nonetheless, when the project finished, I, in particular, felt that I had an obligation to try harder to understand why it seemingly failed. Was logic programming really at the heart of the failure? Despite this recent resurgence that we've seen with Logic Box, Edelog, studying in Van Lem Elkin's studies of human thinking, I at least believe that there are problems with logic programming. Logic programming, its time has not come, despite indications that maybe it has. And in particular, there are two major problems that need to be solved. And at least one of these problems goes back to the disputes between declarative and imperative or procedural representations that occurred in the late 1960s. One of these problems concerns the relationship between declarative and imperative representations of knowledge. To this day, we have a very poor understanding, and in particular, we have forgotten the arguments for the procedural interpretation coming from MIT, which, as aggressively as it may have been put, nonetheless was a very creative part of the development of logic programming. Current approaches to logic programming seem, on the surface at least, to have forgotten that message, to argue in favor of purely logical representations without control of any kind. If you look at answer set programming and if you look at some data log, there seems to be a belief that logic is good and control is bad. You should simply say what you want and don't say anything about how you want what you want to be achieved. Computational thinking is bad. Algorithmic thinking is bad. Problem decomposition is bad. So the pure logicians who are among those promoting logic programming today are potentially opening themselves up to that very same criticism that we had 50 years ago emanating from MIT. And I think those critics were right to criticize that there is something in that criticism and that we do need more to do. We need not only to understand what we want, but also how we want to achieve it. And I believe that if we pay proper attention to that, then we can begin to reconcile declarative and imperative representations and languages. And that's the first problem. That's the first problem that I believe is unresolved. And it's a scandalous problem, because if computer science is to be a science, it shouldn't be a science of 100 or 1,000 different programming paradigms. You shouldn't, if you want to teach computational thinking, have to choose between teaching children to think object-orientedly, functionally, aspect-orientedly. You should have a proper understanding of the relationship between good thinking, logical thinking, and computational thinking. But there's another problem. That was problem number one. The other problem is the one that the RuleML+RR wing of this meeting is all about, namely the relationship and the confusion between different kinds of rules. What is a rule? If you look at the prologue textbooks, you have facts and rules. If you look at production systems, you have rules. If you look at many papers will talk about rules and won't tell you what kind of rules they're talking about. Does that mean that both kinds of rules are the same, or is there some real difference between them? Now, if you look at the most famous, most important, most influential book on artificial intelligence, textbook by Russell and Norvig, you'll learn that rules, production rules in particular, are just horn clauses used to reason forwards. Production systems are just horn clauses used, in other words, they're data log, or plot with other data structures. On the other hand, if you read Herbert Simon's Introduction to Production Systems in the MIT Encyclopedia of Cognitive Science, you'll learn that Prolog is just another production system language. If you read Paul Thagard, his Introduction to Cognitive Science for young undergraduates, you'll learn that logic and rules, by which he means production rules, are very different. They may look similar, but they're absolutely different. Rules have nothing to do with logic. You can do things with rules that you couldn't possibly aspire to do with logic. Now here's a book being used on a daily basis in who knows how many universities and colleges, poisoning the minds of young people. So what is the truth? What is the truth? The situation is worse than Joe's Guide to Philosophy. The differences between Plato and Aristotle and Hume and Kant. There are two kinds of rules. I've contributed to a tutorial where we argue that there are two kinds of rules. There are deductive rules and active rules. There are BDI rules, some of which are belief rules and some of which are goal rules. David Hurrell, that famous computer scientist, also argued there are two kinds of computer systems: transformational systems, which are like logic programs, and reactive systems, which are like production rules. John Searle, the philosopher, argued there are two kinds of rules. There are constitutive rules, which effectively function as definitions, which are also like logic programs, and there are regulatory rules, which are rules of behavior, which in effect are like production rules. But then if there are two kinds of rules, we have the dilemma that we have with imperative and declarative languages. What, if any, is the relationship between them? Friebe and I have developed a language which attempts to deal with these issues. Thanks to Miguel, however, we finally have an implementation which the world can make it pass its own judgments on, but it's early days. Whether it's the right work or not, and I really hope somebody else will tackle these problems, and if they come up with a different solution, at least tackle the problem. Well, that was the last 60 years, if you go back as far as Joe's Guide to Philosophy. So, what about the next 50 to 60 years? Well, I have a dream that one day we'll all speak the same language. One day we won't have 100, 1,000 different computer languages with different paradigms. They'll all be the same paradigm which smoothly combines both declarative and imperative modes of expression. It'll put a lot of researchers out of work. It will not be popular, it will be resisted at every step. But I like to think it's already begun. Well, as many of you know, in this last year we've had a number of tragedies, other than Donald Trump, other than Brexit. Alan Robinson passed away, Koichi Furukawa passed away, Alan Kamurawer passed away. I like to think if they were here with us today, they would welcome my vision of the future, and they would be glad to have contributed to it, because they certainly have. So please join me in offering a toast to our dear departed friends, Alain, Koichi, and Alain. Thank you.